At that moment, she was no longer busy dying. She was just being, and dying was happening. And to tell you how extraordinary this, just to complete this story, right at the last moment, she said, "Richard, sit me up," because I'm Richard to my family. She said, "Richard, sit me up." So I sat her up. I put her legs over the bed, and her body was falling forward, so I put my hand on her chest, and her body fell back, so I put my other hand on the back, and her head was lolling, so I put my head against her head. We were just sitting there together, and she took 3 breaths, slow, deep breaths, and she left. Now, if you read in the ancient Tibetan texts the way in which conscious lamas leave their body, they sit up, they take 3 breaths, and they leave. Who was she? How did she know that? What was that about? I just want to play with you with the mysteries that I play with. Ramana Maharshi, who was a great Indian saint, was dying of cancer. And they said, "Let's treat it." And he said, no, it's time to drop this body. Because in India, it's called dropping the body. And you hear the implication of it, that there is something that drops the body. The body doesn't drop itself. The body is dropped. And his devotees started to cry. And they said, "Don't leave us, don't leave us." And he looked at them with confusion. He said, "Don't be silly. Where could I go? I'm just dying. Don't make such a big deal. It's like I'm just selling the Ford, It's not such a big deal. I'm just dying." So the dying center, in my mind, was an institution where people like me who wanted to be around people that were dying as part of their spiritual work on themselves would create the support system, whether they were nurses or doctors or attendants or whatever. And the place would be open to people who wished to use their death as a vehicle for their own awakening. Because as you're going through these processes, for a person that really sees life's journey as a one of spiritual work on oneself, this is an optimum set of experiences to work with, the process of dying. So if you imagine now, you have an institution in which everybody in the institution is there in order to spiritually awaken. They're called monasteries or ashrams. It happens there are dyers and there are helpers of dyers there. But that's ground, not figure. The figure is the spiritual awakening. And everybody's there for the same reason. What I experience is that when I am with somebody, I work a lot with AIDS patients. Now here's a young person who very often is the object of social stigma. They're dealing with family rejection often. They're dealing with an opportunistic illness in which there are symptoms that are occurring in a jumbled mass, and you feel better, and then you feel sick, and then you hit here and then hit there. They're dealing with economic difficulty. When I come in to be with them, the first thing I have to do when I sit down with them is to open myself to all my reactions to their predicament. The minute I try to deny it, it catches me. So I have to open myself to it. So I have to open myself to my empathic reactions. That is, to me as a separate entity, feeling what it would feel like if I were being socially ostracized, had an opportunistic illness, was young, didn't have a chance to live out my dreams. All of it, all of the pain of it. It's only when Zalman gave me a beautiful line. I was interviewing him for a television show, and I said, "Zalman, if you were an Israeli, what would you say to a Palestinian?" And Zalman said, "Oy. Oy, such a problem." He said, before we can be with one another, we have to learn to grieve with one another. We have to open ourselves to grieve for the other person's loss and pain. And when they feel heard in the grief, then we can start to meet behind the grief. And what I've learned is, in whether I'm dealing in this, because I do a lot of work with political activists, and when I'm dealing with people of different ethnic origins and minority groups and all kinds of diversity, that I can always be my spiritual cuteness and up-level and say, we're all one. What are you so busy being black or, Latino, Chicano, or whatever? They say, oh, that's not going to work. You are not hearing us. But if we sit with each other and grieve together, then we rise into the place of unity behind it. So when I sit with somebody, the first thing I have to do is open my heart as a separate entity to this other separate entity and go through the process of empathy. That's not compassion yet, that's empathy. Of as a separate entity feeling what they're feeling. To be able to do that is interesting. To be able to keep your heart open in hell, really. To keep your heart open when it's breaking in a situation. To do that requires that you have cultivated the spiritual perspective behind it that allows for the wisdom of the universe, that allows for the, this is a little much to say, but it's true, that allows for the perfection that exists even within the imperfection. And once you are rooted in that understanding, if you have stood back, if you've been able to stand back enough to see the beauties of the laws of the universe, to see the exquisite intricacy of the unfolding of the spark of God manifesting into form, the Shekhinah. If you see that, just the brilliance of it, you are in awe. And at that point, the little mind that you have, which is just part of the manifestation, suddenly gets humble before that. And instead of saying, this is terrible, this suffering is awful, if I were doing it, I'd do it differently, you say, I really don't understand. But there's a place in me that has faith in the unfolding. What has happened to me as a result of inner work, which I am talking about and commending to you, is that two planes of consciousness, living both with the perfection and with the pain of the suffering, allows you to stay with the pain without pushing it away, because you have the balance within yourself. It's as if you're part of the unity and you're also separate. You're part of the unfolding of all that includes suffering. Like with Phyllis, how am I to say now that the pain she went through that forced her to give up, that led to the spiritual awakening for her the few days before she died, I wouldn't have personally given her that pain, because I couldn't have done that. But am I to judge that as somehow wrong? And I'm faced with the paradox that I, as a human with a human emotional heart, want to take away your suffering. And at the same moment, there's another part of me that understands that suffering is grace. That suffering is the sandpaper from the spiritual point of view that is awakening people. And once you've started to spiritually awaken, you re-perceive your own suffering and start to work with it as a vehicle for awakening. Now, the interesting part of that paradox is you don't say to another person that says, oh, I'm suffering, you don't say, hey, it's grace. See? You have to give people space to do what they need to do. And if they're at the stage of their evolution where they see their suffering as this horrible thing that's being done to them, you can do the best you can to remove their suffering, the way they're experiencing their suffering. As my guru says, God comes to the hungry in the form of food, and you get what you need. So when I come in with somebody, let me give you an example. Woman, 42 years old, very wealthy, very beautiful, very talented, very creative, is dying of AIDS. And she comes to me several months before she's dying, and she said, Ram Dass, I wonder if you would help me die. And I said, well, great, we'll do it together. So we started to meditate together, we started to talk, we started to read things and discuss them. And she said, I'd like to stay as conscious as I can through this process. Because you understand that the more you are aware of the spiritual nature of life, the more you see the moment of death as a moment for release, for taking off the tight shoe. And the art form in dying is that at the moment of death, you are neither grabbing at life nor pushing it away. You're neither pushing nor pulling. It's the attraction and aversion that keeps you holding to form. So to prepare for the moment of death, when the processes that go on in consciousness are a dissolving of boundaries, a speeding up of awareness, a kind of an opening and expanding. To be in that process where you don't go, no, and grab hold, one prepares. One prepares for the moment of death. And it's interesting that in almost all the Eastern traditions,